Hello, everyone. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with where you from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep pulling you stories like this. Now, let the shadows take over. Story 1, The Man Behind the Porch Light. The cold in Burlington, Vermont, in late October 2022 wasn't sharp yet, but it had a clear, bracing edge. It was the kind of cold that carried sound beautifully and made the warm hum of a buzzing porch light feel like a vital source of heat. I'm Claire Holden, 31, a middle school history teacher. I live in an old clapboard house on a street that still takes Halloween seriously. And for the first few hours of the night, the world felt precisely as it should, steeped in cozy autumn nostalgia. My hands were sticky with residual sugar from 1,000 tiny wrappers. My living room was lit only by the electric glow of the fireplace and the intermittent, flashing chaos from the bowl of candy on my lap. The early shift of trick-or-treaters, the tiny princesses, the earnest superheroes, the groups of parents shepherding their costumed flocks was pure, loud joy. Every time I opened the door, the cold air rushed in carrying the scent of damp wool, chocolate, and the sharp, clean smell of burning wood from a nearby chimney. The sound of children's laughter, bright and frantic, echoed off the neighboring houses. It was the best kind of performance, and I was happily playing my part. But the night, like all things, was finite. By 10:30, the momentum had died. The steady stream had slowed to a few stragglers. By 11, it was silence. The mad, distant laughter of trick-or-treaters had faded street by street, dissolving into the quiet hum of the suburb. Now, the only sound was the soft sigh of the wind and the scrape of dry maple leaves across the wooden porch, a sound that, in the quiet, started to feel less natural and more like someone dragging their feet slowly across the planks. I stacked the remaining candy into the bowl and pulled my knitted cardigan tighter. The heat from the fireplace was a comfort, but the isolation was starting to settle in. It's a different kind of quiet when you live alone, a quiet that feels less like peace and more like a void waiting to be filled. I was about to stand up, ready to concede the night, when I looked out past the porch railing. He wasn't at the door. He wasn't even on my lawn. He was standing on the sidewalk, positioned directly under the old oak tree 20 feet from my steps, where the shadow was deepest. He wore a generic, oversized raincoat, the kind of yellow you see on emergency workers, and a mask, a cheap plastic clown mask. Not a clever stylized one, but the kind you find in discount bins, a perfectly round, white face with exaggerated, painted-on eyebrows and a wide, unsettlingly placid red smile, the kind of smile that promised no joy, only emptiness. He was too old to be a trick-or-treater, too still to be a neighbor. My first thought was that he was waiting for a ride. My second was that he was waiting for me. I didn't move. I sat there in the orange glow of the electric fire, watching. The mask was static, but the man inside was a dense, black outline, utterly motionless. His stillness was what made him predatory. He wasn't wandering. He was positioned. I counted slowly, deliberately. 1 minute, 2 minutes. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't check his phone. He just stood under the humming, white-hot spotlight of the single street lamp. The wind kicked up, making the leaves on the porch scrape, scrape, scrape. Again. It sounded exactly like the latch of a lock being tried. I tried to rationalize it. A drunk, a harmless lurker, but my professional instinct, the teacher's instinct to assess the danger in a room, screamed at me. His gaze, though hidden, was focused entirely on the porch light, on the one bright spot that signaled home. By 11:45, my heart was a dull, heavy thump against my ribs. The candy bowl was still on my lap. I hadn't moved. I watched him blink, just a quick, almost imperceptible tilt of the head as the mask caught the light, a confirmation that he was, indeed, alive and awake. I needed to end the night. I needed to signal that the show was over. I stood up slowly, making sure not to cross the rectangle of light cast by the front windows. I walked to the switch near the door. My hand was shaking so badly I had to use 2 fingers. The moment the white porch light snapped off, the world outside became a suffocating blackness. The cold air rushed through the doorframe, now just another dark shape. It felt like throwing down a gauntlet. I didn't wait. I turned the deadbolt, threw the chain across, and then the final latch. Every click was a desperate, loud announcement of my presence and my fear. Then, I did the stupid thing. The thing characters in movies always do. I crept back to the window. The Venetian blinds in the living room are old, the slats warped. I tilted them just enough, a fraction of an inch, to see the sliver of the street. The street lamp was still casting its yellow-white cone of light. The oak tree still threw its shadow. And the clown was still there. But he wasn't standing on the sidewalk anymore. He had moved onto the lawn. He was now just 10 feet from the porch railing, out of the deep shadow. He was facing the house, his shoulders slightly hunched. The cheap, red smile of the mask seemed to reflect the residual glow from the living room windows. He was waiting for the light to come back on. I pulled back from the blinds, my back hitting the wall with a soft thud. I sank down. My knees pulled to my chest. I couldn't breathe properly. The adrenaline was a sick taste in my mouth. Call someone. Call the police. I fumbled for my phone in my back pocket. I needed noise. I needed light. I needed contact with the real world. The screen flickered to life, the brightness and aggressive intrusion in the dim room. 1% battery. The red icon glared at me, mocking my desperation. I jabbed at the emergency dialer, trying to get to 911. My fingers were too shaky. I kept hitting the wrong numbers. Then, the lights in the room began to flicker. Not a power surge, but a slow, rhythmic, dim, bright, dim, bright. The ancient wiring in the house was protesting the cold, or perhaps protesting the presence outside. The electric fire died with a faint pop. The power failure was the final, critical loss of control. I was alone, isolated, and losing my connection to the outside world. I had to look. My fear was no longer about safety, it was about confirmation. I crawled back to the window, pulling my eye level with the warped slats. The dark space between the house and the clown was gone. The plastic smiling mask was there, pressed against the glass of the window. It was so close that the curvature of the cheap plastic was distorted. The red lips stretched and flattened. The white of the mask had turned gray from the moisture of his breath, which bloomed and receded against the glass with a terrifyingly steady rhythm. The sound was the worst, a soft, almost imperceptible tss as the hard plastic pressed against the cold pane, a patient, intimate sound that signaled he hadn't broken the glass because he hadn't needed to. He was simply letting me know he was there. I inhaled a sharp, involuntary gasp. My throat seized. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The mask, distorted and enormous, moved slowly, deliberately, from the glass and slid down the pane just far enough for the painted eyes to align perfectly with mine. I stared into the shallow, painted black circles, and for one paralyzing, eternal second, I saw nothing but the reflection of my own terror staring back. I don't know how I called 911. I must have managed it during the time I scrabbled backward across the wooden floor, phone dead in my hand, screaming a soundless scream that was only an echo in my chest. 10 minutes later, the flashing blue and red strobes of the police cruiser bathed the street in chaotic, anxious light. 2 officers approached the house, heavy footsteps crushing the leaves. The lawn was empty. The porch was empty. They found nothing. No footprints in the soft, frozen dirt of the garden beds. No signs of forced entry. They took my statement the hysterical ramblings of a teacher convinced a clown was trying to steal her life. Just as the officers were preparing to leave, one of them pointed down. Under the buzzing, now relit porch fixture, half hidden by a scatter of maple leaves, lay a single white object. The plastic clown mask. It had been discarded, casually tossed aside. The officer used a pencil to lift it, and I watched, paralyzed, as he turned it over. The inside, where the plastic had rested against the skin, was dark with moisture. "It's still faintly warm," the officer muttered, dropping it into an evidence bag. They left. The porch light continued its lonely, frantic hum against the cold air. I knew then that the man hadn't left because he was scared off. He had left because the swap was complete. The mask, the thing that contained his anonymity, had been delivered to the house. I looked out the window one last time before dawn. The street was empty, but in the thin, metallic reflection of the glass, I swore I could still see the distorted, wide, red smile. And I realized that the man in the yellow coat was likely already inside, waiting for the next autumn to start his performance again. Story 2, The Last Candy Bowl. I should have known better than to think Halloween in Salem, Massachusetts, would be simple. I'm an accountant, 37 years old, built on spreadsheets and logic. In October 21, I had just bought a small 2-story colonial near the outskirts, far enough from the tourist madness, but close enough that the night still felt charged. On the 30th, I set up my porch, a basic plastic cauldron, filled with the standard variety pack. I didn't want to deal with the inevitable mob, so I wrote a sign. "Please take one. Thank you," and secured it to the railing. The atmosphere was perfect, almost suffocating in its classic autumn charm. The night was cold, but still, carrying the heavy, cloying scent of burned candle wax and decaying pumpkin flesh, the collective perfume of 1,000 jack-o'-lanterns. My own porch was draped in fake spider silk, and the old porch swing creaked softly in the wind. A rhythmic, lonely sigh that was supposed to sound cozy, but now feels like a metronome counting down the seconds. I retreated to my living room, watching the parade of small bodies, ghosts, zombies, and endless variations of pop culture through the sheer curtain. The bowl emptied quickly, which was satisfying. I watched the last group of teens grab handfuls and disappear. At 11:30 p.m., the street went silent. I waited 5 minutes, then went to retrieve the empty bowl. It wasn't empty. It was full, brimful, in fact. But it wasn't my candy. Mine was the cheap, individually wrapped stuff. This was different. There were foil-wrapped artisanal chocolates, several heavy, clear sugar rocks that looked old-fashioned, and a scattering of dark, non-branded truffles. It was better, more expensive, and strangely personal. I stood there, holding the cold metal railing, staring at the bowl. I felt that first fleeting sensation of mild curiosity. A neighbor, I reasoned, someone playing a late-night joke, being generous, an eccentric local, maybe. I brought the bowl inside, dumped the unexpected haul into a Tupperware container, and went to bed. the mystery filed away as quirky Salem charm. The next night was Halloween, October 31st. I was more prepared. I refilled the bowl with my original boring stock and secured the bowl with a wire tie to the railing so no one could steal it. Then I settled in, my logical accountant brain already sketching out theories. It had to be a timed drop-off, a prank that required a few minutes of my absence. I would prove it was just a local. The house was chaotic until 10 p.m. When the final wave subsided, I checked the bowl. Empty. I left it there, then locked my front door and turned off every light in the house, except for the dim glow from my computer screen in the back room. I sat in absolute silence, waiting, watching the front porch through the living room window. An hour passed. The creaking of the porch swing in the increased wind was the only constant. My eyes ached in the dark. At 11:17 p.m., it happened. One moment, the bowl was undeniably empty. The next, it was full. I didn't see the figure approach. I didn't see a car or a shadow. My attention had been pulled away for maybe 3 seconds by a loud, sudden gust of wind rattling the kitchen window. In that tiny, blind moment, the transaction occurred. I jumped up, stumbling across the carpet to the front window, my heart hammered, no longer with curiosity, but with a deep, immediate unease. I ripped the curtain aside. Nothing. The street was empty, the air thick with the smell of wet leaves and the buzzing of the porch light. I cautiously opened the door. The bowl was full again. The new candy was even weirder. There were small, brittle cookies shaped like human fingers and little black candies that looked suspiciously like compressed earth. This wasn't a joke. This was intimate. It felt like a collection. I slept badly. The image of those small, dark candies burned into my retina. On November 1st, the whole block felt deflated. Jack-o'-lanterns were collapsing in on themselves, looking like burnt skulls. I left the bowl empty, convinced whatever game was being played was over. But the game wasn't over. It was escalating. I came home from work to find the bowl on my porch, full. The candy this time was uniformly white small, irregular spheres that resembled, with unnerving accuracy, molar teeth. This wasn't a neighbor's idea of fun. A neighbor would have stopped when they realized they were scaring me. A neighbor would have been caught. This was operating outside the rules of engagement. I began to watch the house that night, glued to the window, utterly unable to focus on my laptop. I wasn't waiting for a prankster. I was waiting for intrusion. Past midnight, when the wind died down and the air turned utterly still, I heard it. A sound that was quiet, but unmistakable, traveling clearly up the path where the gravel crunched. It wasn't the heavy thud of a boot or the sharp tap of a shoe. It was a soft, dull slap, slap, slap sound. The sound of bare feet on gravel. Wet, heavy, bare feet. The sound moved slowly, rhythmically, from the street, up the walkway, and stopped directly at my porch steps. I held my breath, pressing my face against the glass, trying to pierce the blackness. I saw nothing but a shift in the shadow, a slightly deeper blackness against the gray of the wooden railing. The bowl clinked. The sound of my cheap plastic bowl protesting the addition of a heavy mass. The bass slap, slap, slap retreated back down the gravel path, fading into the ambient hum. When I finally ripped the door open, the sight chilled me to the core. The bowl was overflowing with candy that was now all the same small, perfectly square cubes of dark, impossibly hard caramel. It was an offering, a relentless, escalating payment. But nestled right on top of the caramel squares was a small piece of folded, heavy parchment. My hands were shaking as I snatched it up, retreating inside and slamming the door shut. I unfolded the paper in the glare of the kitchen light. It was written in a cramped, elegant cursive, but the ink looked like it had been applied with a sharp stick. The single line of text, undeniable and cold. "You owe me one." The realization hit me with psychological dread. I hadn't been gifted anything. I had been in a contract. I had established a system of exchange. I gave my candy, and in return, I was paid in kind, night after night. Now the entity felt I was in its debt. I spent the next day, November 2nd, boarding up the crawl space under the porch, ripping out the gravel, and packing all the remaining candy into plastic bags for disposal. I called a locksmith to upgrade the deadbolts. I told myself it was over. That night, I sat in the living room, lights blazing, listening to the rain that had started coming down hard. The house was locked down. The porch was bare. My accountancy training demanded I find a rational explanation. But the memory of the bare feet on gravel killed every theory. At 1:00 a.m., the lights began to flicker. It wasn't the rhythmic protest of old wiring this time. It was a dying, chaotic spasm. On, off, on, dim. My mind raced. A breaker, water damage, anything but him. Then I heard it, not from the door, not from the window, but from directly beneath my feet. A low, resonant thud. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. Thud. A pause. Thud. It was knocking from under the porch. A heavy, muffled impact against the joists that were supporting my floor, my sofa, and my entire terrified body. The sound traveled through the floorboards, intimate and chilling. It knew where I lived. It was home. Thud, thud, thud. As the knocking continued, demanding attention, the overhead light gave one last, frantic flash and flickered out completely, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The only thing left was the sound of the rain, the steady thud, thud, thud from the blackness beneath the house, and the knowledge that the debt had come due. Story 3: The Sound Under the Mask. It was Halloween night, 2020 in Tempe, Arizona. The pandemic had forced the parties underground, literally. My friend, Jason, had rented a cheap, sprawling house off campus, and the action was mostly crammed into a low-ceilinged, airless basement. I was 24, a grad student. I remember the immediate sensory overload when I walked down those creaky wooden steps. The air was thick, suffocating. There was the constant mechanical hiss and the chemical smell of cheap fog machine fluid, mixed with sweat, stale beer, and the cloying sweetness of punch. The heat was oppressive, radiating off too many bodies pressed together in a small space, making the air feel viscous. The music was a throbbing, relentless bass line, its volume cranked so high it vibrated in my chest. Even when I tried to talk, the sound was muffled through my own ears, a heavy, insistent pressure against the walls of my skull. It was meant to be fun, a chaotic sensory escape, but after an hour, it was just exhausting. That's when I saw him. He was standing slightly apart from the crowd, near the concrete stairs, perfectly still. He wore a heavy, tailored suit, which was itself odd in the casual basement heat. But the mask was the centerpiece. It was smooth, featureless, and made of polished chrome, reflecting the erratic lights and bodies around him in sharp, distorted streaks. It covered his entire head and neck, with no visible mouth or eye holes, just tiny, almost invisible slits near the collar line. He didn't move or dance. He just stood, radiating an unnatural coldness in the overwhelming heat. I was dressed as something simple, a beat poet, and I was nursing a plastic cup of punch. I watched him for 5 minutes, drawn by the stillness. It felt like an anchor dropped into a fast-moving current. "Who's the silver guy?" I shouted to Jason, who was passing by, dressed in a hastily made wizard costume. Jason shrugged, already swaying back toward the crowd. "No idea. Some guy my roommate invited, doesn't talk, just stands." I took that as a challenge. I navigated the dense crowd, the sticky floor, grabbing at my shoes with every step. "Cool mask," I said, stopping a respectful distance away. I had to shout to be heard over the music. "Can you even see in that thing?" He didn't move. The chrome mask simply reflected the chaotic dance of the party lights. "It must be hot," I pressed, trying to break the tension. "You must be cooking under there." Still nothing. No gesture, no acknowledgement. I leaned in, getting closer than I should have, my voice dropping. "It's a party. You have to participate. Man, say something, anything." That's when I heard it. Not a word, not a laugh, but a sound that the mask, despite its polished, sealed surface, failed to contain. It was breathing. Deep, wet, a slow, measured rasp. The sound wasn't coming from his chest. It seemed to be coming from the mask itself, amplified and synthetic. It was the sound of air being pulled through a small, wet filter, struggling against resistance. Hiss, inhale, heavy exhale. It was loud enough to cut through the relentless thumping bass line, but only because I was standing so close. It was the only sound he made. It was the only sound he needed to make. It was the sound of pure, quiet exertion. I stepped back abruptly. Irritation dissolved into a creeping discomfort. The sound felt possessive, intimate, like something that shouldn't be shared. "Okay," I muttered, shaking my head. "Creepy." I turned, fighting my way back toward the punch bowl. I tried to forget him, but every time the music paused or a new song started, I could still hear that wet, heavy hiss and rasp in my inner ear. I ended up leaving early, exhausted by the heat and the persistent echo of that mechanical breathing. It was nearly 100 a.m. when I walked out of the house and onto the street. The abrupt silence of the late-night residential neighborhood was a blessed relief. The air was cool and dry, a clean contrast to the basement humidity. I was walking down an empty side street, the only light coming from the occasional street lamp. The thumping bass of the party was now just a distant, benign vibration. Then I heard it again. Hiss, inhale, heavy exhale. It wasn't the memory. It was real, and it was behind me. I stopped dead still, every hair on my neck rising. The blood drained from my face. I could hear my own heart hammering a nervous rhythm against the deep, wet rasp. The sound was not loud. It was soft, intimate, precisely the volume it had been in the basement, close enough to be undeniably present, close enough to suggest someone walking at the exact same pace, maintaining the exact same distance. I turned around quickly. The street was empty. Nothing but parked cars and the black geometric shapes of trees. I turned back and started walking faster. The breathing sped up to match me, not running, but keeping pace, a steady, deliberate hiss, hiss, hiss. My heart shifted from nervous dread to pure, focused terror. I didn't dare run. Running would confirm I knew he was there. I kept walking, fast, shoulders tight, fighting the desperate urge to look back again. The breathing became the soundtrack to my fear. It wasn't the sound of chasing. It was the sound of following. It felt meticulous, patient, like a machine programmed to maintain a set proximity. It was the sound of a pure, sustained effort, and that felt worse than any scream. I made the final turn onto my street. The breathing was right behind me, now maybe only 6 feet away. I could feel the microscopic shift in air pressure. The sound was so close it felt like my own malfunctioning lungs. I fumbled with my keys, my hand slick with sweat. The rasping breath was right at my shoulder, a damp, chilling presence. I shoved the key into the lock, threw the door open, dove inside, and slammed the deadbolt home. Throwing the chain and the final latch, I slid down the door, gasping, my own breath now mirroring the frantic sound that had just been outside. The only sound now was the deafening silence of my hallway, and then the faint, persistent hiss inhale right through the thin wood of the door. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, the sound of the house settling, the groan of the old foundation, the tick of the refrigerator now amplified and hostile. In the morning, the harsh Arizona sun felt like a betrayal. I walked the house, checking every window, every lock. Nothing was disturbed. The porch was empty. It took me 3 days to regain some semblance of logic. It had to be a cruel prank. Jason's roommate, someone from the party who had recognized me. The breathing was just a sound effect from the mask. On the 4th day, I finally dared to enter my bedroom closet to find clean clothes. The closet was a narrow, floor-to-ceiling space with a mirror bolted to the inside of the door. I walked in, pulled out a sweater, and automatically glanced at the mirror. I saw my reflection, Kelsey, tired, pale, but whole. I turned to close the door, but paused. I looked back into the mirror, and I saw the depth behind my own image. The space in the closet was small. I had my sweater in my hand, and on the back wall of the closet, hanging on a hook I never used, was something new. It was a mask, not the chrome one. This one was flat, made of rough, dark leather, with simple, crude stitching around the edges. It was an empty, unsettling face. But the horror wasn't the mask itself. It was the realization that I had never noticed it before. And then I saw the detail. Reflected in the center of the leather mask, like a distorted tear, was the sharp, metallic glint of chrome. And the reflection showed the chrome mask hanging right next to the leather one, deep in the shadows. The chrome mask wasn't there in real life. It was only there in the reflection, right behind the leather one, positioned so that if I were to put on the leather mask, the chrome one would be staring directly at the back of my head. I didn't scream. I just backed out of the closet slowly, never taking my eyes off the mirror. I slammed the door and braced myself against it, my ears ringing in the total silence of the house. But I knew the breathing hadn't been an intruder. It had been an echo, a sound effect that had been successfully transferred. And the mask, the original chrome one, was still here, waiting for the sound to start again. Story 4, The Empty Street. The isolation of the night shift is a specific kind of cold. October 2019, Cedar Rapids. I was 42, a nurse at St. Luke's, and Halloween had bled into November 1st. My shift ended at 2 a.m. Stepping out of the hospital, the air hit me a heavy, damp blanket. It wasn't freezing, but there was that pervasive, melancholic chill that seeps into your bones. It had started to rain. A soft, steady drizzle on the windshield that didn't require wipers, but made the light refract into smudged, watercolor halos. My drive home was always the same. Empty roads, long stretches of suburban quiet where the city seems to hold its breath. It's a route I know by heart: intersections, potholes, the exact spots where the streetlights are burned out. I had the radio on, set to an oldies station, but the signal was weak tonight. Just a low hiss of static on the radio, occasionally punctuated by a fragmented song lyric. It was more comfort than content, a proof of connection. The atmosphere was thick with leftover holiday tension. I kept passing abandoned porches, jack-o'-lanterns already rotting, melting into orange slush, limp, plastic figures swaying slightly in the drizzle. The holiday was over. The city was asleep. I was maybe 10 minutes from home, moving slowly through a dense residential area, when I saw him. He was standing on the corner of First Avenue and Elmwood, directly under a street lamp. The light there was a sickly, intense yellow, cutting through the low mist. It cast a perfect circle of visibility in the surrounding blackness. The figure was small, a child. He was wearing a simple, homemade ghost costume, just a sheet, cut crudely with eye holes. A small black plastic pumpkin bucket hung from one hand. He was completely motionless, facing away from me toward a dark two-story house. My first emotion was not fear, but a surge of immediate, professional sympathy. 2 o'clock in the morning, 10 degrees above freezing. This was not a prank. This was a problem. A lost kid. I eased my Toyota to the curb, pulling up about 50 feet behind him. The engine sound died with a heavy tick. The only noise was the gentle shh of the rain on the roof. I lowered my window, letting the cold, wet air rush in. "Hey," I called out, my voice a clumsy boom in the silence. "You all right? Kid, you lost." He didn't move. "It's late," I continued, trying to sound gentle and non-threatening. "Where are your parents? I can help you find them." The wind picked up, swirling a few wet leaves around his small, still feet. And then very slowly he began to turn. It wasn't the sudden snap of a startled child. It was a fluid, deliberate rotation, as if the entire figure was mounted on a turntable. The movement took perhaps 5 seconds. The white sheet folded over his small body with a dull, heavy whisper. The crude, jagged eye holes of the sheet were now facing my car, the face under the sheet. What little I could make out was simply shadow. My sympathy curdled into cold unease. There was something profoundly wrong with the posture. Too rigid, too perfect. I didn't open the door. I reached for my phone, but before I could unlock it, the static on the radio surged, overwhelming the low-key song fragments with a sudden, sharp burst of hissing, white noise. My hand froze on the phone, and through the harsh static, a voice cut in. It wasn't a DJ. It wasn't human. It was flat, mechanical, almost computerized, like a poorly translated voice synthesized from an old weather report. The voice was listing numbers. 4, 2, Alpha, Delta, 6, 6. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't need to check my registration. 42 AD 666, my Iowa license plate number. The numbers repeated, slower this time. 4, 2, Alpha, Delta, 6, 6. It was a personal call sign, an acknowledgement. My attention snapped back to the child under the light. He was still facing me, the dark eye holes fixed on my car. I reached for the door lock, clicking the button to ensure both doors were secured. The small, almost imperceptible thunk of the solenoid was deafening. The static on the radio died abruptly. The voice was gone. But now, a single new sound filled the car. It was the sound of something tapping gently against the windshield, right where the rain was flowing. Tap, tap. I looked up. The small black plastic pumpkin bucket he had been holding was pressed against the glass. He hadn't walked to the car. He had simply arrived. The sheet was inches from my face. I couldn't see the edges of the eye holes, only the immense, terrifying blackness beneath them. There was no fabric texture, only pure shadow. The dread sheet became a visceral spike of ice in my chest. This wasn't a lost child. This was something that knew my routine, my route, and my license plate. I didn't scream. I jammed the car into drive, my foot slamming the accelerator to the floor. The tires squealed once on the wet pavement, fighting for purchase. The car launched forward. My head snapped back against the headrest. I didn't look back for a long, panicked minute. I drove through stop signs, blew through yellow lights. All I could feel was the intense, burning heat of the adrenaline and the knowledge that I had been found. When I finally dared to glance in the rear view mirror, the street was a receding, dark blur. The street lamp at First and Elmwood was dead. The hot yellow light had flickered out, leaving that specific corner in the uniform blackness of the Iowa night. But as I watched, the yellow light shuddered, sputtered, and flickered back on, with a weak, sickly glow. The light cut through the mist, illuminating the exact spot where the child had been standing. The child was still there, but he wasn't alone. Two figures now stood beneath the light. The first was the small ghost, unmoving. And beside him, slightly taller, stood a second figure. This one was dressed in black. I couldn't make out any details of the costume, but its silhouette was wider, heavier, and it was holding something long and slender, like a cane or a staff. Both figures were facing the direction I had just come from. They were looking at the empty street where my car had been. And as I watched them shrink in the tiny frame of the rearview mirror, the second figure, the adult one, slowly, deliberately, raised its hand and pointed directly at my car. Then, the street lamp died again. This time, it stayed dark. I drove until the sunrise bleached the sky gray, the fragments of static on my radio mocking the profound, terrifying silence of the road. The knowledge remains I was marked, and I broke the routine. And now, they know I'm the one who drives the 42 AD 666. Story 5, The Leftover Pumpkin. You get used to a certain kind of decay in November. I'm 35, a librarian, and I live alone in a quiet, tree-lined street in Rochester. November 1st is always marked by the heavy, sweet and sour smell of wet leaves and melting sugar. The municipal cleanup after the chaotic joy of Halloween. It's a sad, quiet day. My own porch was bare. I hadn't carved a pumpkin in years. Since the divorce, the effort felt redundant. I left for work at 8:00 a.m. When I came home at 5:30 p.m., the air was already heavy with an early dusk and a damp chill. And there it was, sitting right on the top step, where my welcome mat should have been, was a pumpkin. Not just a pumpkin, a jack-o'-lantern. It was large, bulbous, and already bad. The rind was a sickly, deep orange-brown, covered in a patchy iridescent mold that shimmered faintly under the porch light. The edges of the carved eyes and the jagged, three-toothed mouth were softened and fuzzy. And the smell, God, the smell. It was a dense, suffocating odor of fermentation and rot, immediately attracting a cloud of tiny wire fruit flies that buzzed under the lamplight, like fine black sand. Someone had clearly played a stupid late prank, dumping their trash on my step. I nudged it with my boot. The entire structure felt soft. I could hear the internal matter shifting, slumping. I fully expected to hear the soft, wet pop of the pumpkin skin collapsing overnight. I was too tired to deal with it. I just stepped around it and went inside, resolving to bag the gross thing in the morning. I was annoyed, not afraid, just fatigued by the absurdity. I woke up expecting to see a puddle of orange slime on the porch. I opened the front door with a grimace, carrying a double-lined garbage bag and a set of rubber gloves. I stopped. The pumpkin was still there, but it wasn't slimy. It wasn't collapsed. It was perfectly fresh. The rind was a vibrant, hard orange, the skin taut. The smell of rot was completely gone, replaced by the earthy, clean scent of fresh gourd. There were no flies. The carving lines were razor sharp, as if they had just been cut. It was undeniably the same pumpkin, the same large, irregular shape, the same 3 distinct teeth in the smile. But the integrity was restored. It defied logic and decomposition. My mind immediately jumped to denial. I was tired. I remembered it wrong. The light was bad. I knelt down and touched the cold, hard rind. No mold. But the smile, the mouth I remembered had been a typical, jagged, slightly menacing jack-o'-lantern grin. This one was different. It was wide, but thin. An elegant crescent moon carved into the flesh. It looked mildly curious. It wasn't menacing at all. It looked like the kind of smile you give someone when you recognize them but can't quite place the name. I took a picture with my phone. Then, I carried it down to the curb, placing it securely in the trash bin. Problem solved. When I returned from work that afternoon, the trash was gone. The porch was empty. I felt a surge of relief. Then, I opened my car door to grab my grocery bag, and there it was, sitting on the passenger seat of my locked car. The pumpkin. Same size, same 3 teeth, fresh, and the smile had changed again. This time, it was a wide, slightly panicked O shape, a caricature of alarm. I slammed the car door shut, my blood running cold. I hadn't used the car all day. It had been locked. I walked the pumpkin to the backyard, threw it over the fence, and watched it land with a muffled thud in the deep pile of wet leaves. I spent a sleepless night, listening to every groan and creak of the old house. I felt a growing sense of obsession overriding the fear. I wasn't dealing with a vandal. I was dealing with an impossible mechanism. The next morning, it was back, on the kitchen counter. The smile was now a perfect lopsided sneer, curled up at one corner. It looked arrogant, confident. This was the moment the denial broke. I wasn't crazy. I was being tested. I am a librarian. I believe in documentation. I bought a cheap webcam, rigged it to a small tripod, and set it up in the living room, aimed directly at the front door. I carried the pumpkin. It felt strangely light this time, almost buoyant, and placed it on the small, square wooden table in the hall. It was the only place in the house where it would be constantly monitored by the camera. I checked the footage every hour. Nothing. No door opening, no flickering light. The timestamp on the video remained steady. I went to bed at 10:00 p.m., leaving the camera running. I woke up, my heart a hammer against my ribs. I practically flew to the computer to check the morning's footage. I scrubbed through the timeline from 1:00 a.m. to 6:00 a.m. Nothing happened. The pumpkin sat motionless on the table, a still orange sentinel. I went into the hall. The pumpkin was there. And the smile had changed. I checked the footage again, rewinding, frame by frame. The transformation was instantaneous and happened without a lapse in the video. At 3:41 a.m., the pumpkin was displaying the arrogant sneer. At 3:41 a.m. in 1 second, the pumpkin displayed a new expression. This new expression wasn't a snarl or a sneer. It was complicated. The mouth was slightly downturned at the corners. The eyes looked wide, but heavy. It was a look of deep, profound, and exhausted melancholy. It was the expression I wear when I sit alone at night, thinking about my life after the divorce. It was my face. The fear gave way to cold, dread. The object was not trying to scare me. It was trying to communicate with me. It was reflecting my inner state, mirroring my exhaustion and grief. All day, the obsession intensified. I kept checking the footage, watching the time, trying to anticipate the switch. When I got home from work, the smile had changed again. This time, it was a tight, strained grimace. The face of someone fighting back tears. That was precisely how I felt after a difficult conversation with my ex-husband that afternoon. The pumpkin was an emotional anchor, a haunted Rorschach test. It was forcing me to confront what I was feeling through its grotesque vegetable face. At 9:00 p.m., I brought it into the bedroom. I needed it close. I placed it on the small nightstand, directly across the room from the camera, which I kept running. I didn't care about a rational explanation anymore. I needed to see what it would show me next. I needed to see what I would become next. I fell asleep around midnight, exhausted by the psychological strain. The recorded footage from that final night, the night I left Rochester, is the only proof. The camera, fixed high on the dresser, captures the entire room, the bed where I am sleeping, the bedside table, and the pumpkin. For hours, the pumpkin sits still, displaying the strained, tearful grimace I had seen earlier. At 4:18 a.m., the light in the room begins to pulse, a soft, slow fluctuation. The camera captures the single decisive change. The pumpkin's face shifts. The downturned mouth slowly, organically, begins to pull upward at the edges. The 3 teeth, sharp and white, settle into a perfectly smooth curve. The eyes narrow slightly, becoming soft, crinkled arcs. It is a smile of absolute serene satisfaction. Then the camera focuses on me, asleep on the bed. My breathing is deep and even. And the final, cold image is of my face. My mouth, in sleep, is curved into the exact same expression as the pumpkin. A quiet, satisfied, perfect smile. I woke up at sunrise, feeling unnaturally rested and calm. I glanced at the pumpkin. It still bore the serene smile. I didn't pack anything except a suitcase of clothes. I took the camera, but I left the pumpkin. I walked out of the house, drove until I hit the state line, and never looked back. I still have the footage, and sometimes, when I see a particularly quiet, contented smile reflected in a store window, I pause. Because I know that perfect, serene curve wasn't mine. It was the pumpkin's, and now it belongs to me. Every Halloween, the streets fill with laughter, footsteps, and people pretending to be things they aren't. But sometimes the masks don't come off when the night ends. Sometimes the ones who knock aren't here for candy. Pause, faint thump, like a single knock on wood. The stories you heard tonight, they all began the same way, a door half open, a friendly smile, a moment of hesitation that decided everything. So if you hear a knock long after the trick-or-treaters are gone, if the porch light flickers, and the street outside is empty, don't open it. Because every Halloween, something still walks from house to house, waiting for someone who doesn't believe in stories. This has been Fearmonger. If you're still awake, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Because somewhere, in some quiet neighborhood, someone's keeping count of the doors still left unlocked.